The smell of cinnamon and vanilla still lingered in my kitchen from the batch of sugar cookies I'd made that morning. Cookies decorated with tiny handprints that would never reach their intended recipients. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the October leaves spiral down onto my perfectly manicured lawn, each fallen leaf reminding me of another missed moment with Emma and little Jake. The ceramic cookie jar, shaped like a grandmother's apron, sat mockingly on my counter, filled with treats that had been meant for tiny hands and bright smiles. My phone buzzed against the granite countertop, displaying yet another unanswered text message to my daughter-in-law, Sarah. The blue bubble containing "The kids would love these cookies" hung there in digital silence, just like the dozen messages before it. The familiar ache settled in my chest as I realized it had been 3 months since I'd heard my grandchildren's laughter echoing through these halls. Before I tell you this incredible story, please hit like and subscribe. I'd love to know in the comments which city you're watching from. My name is Margaret Cox. I'm 58 years old, and until 6 months ago, I thought I had the perfect relationship with my son, David, and his family. Every Sunday, our dining room would fill with the chaos of family dinner. Little Emma's crayon drawings scattered across my mahogany table, while Jake babbled happily in his high chair. The house felt alive then, warm and purposeful. Now, the silence was deafening. David Cox, my only child, had always been my pride and joy. At 32, he'd built a successful career as a marketing manager and seemed to have the perfect marriage with Sarah, his wife of 8 years. They lived just 20 minutes away in a cozy suburban neighborhood, close enough that I could babysit whenever they needed a date night or help with the children. Emma, my spirited 6-year-old granddaughter, had my late husband's green eyes and an infectious giggle that could brighten any room. Little Jake, barely 2, was just learning to form sentences and had recently started calling me Gamma in his sweet, lisping voice. The first sign something was wrong came during what should have been a routine phone call. I was arranging flowers in my living room, the afternoon sun streaming through my lace curtains and casting dancing shadows on the hardwood floors, when I called David to confirm our usual Sunday dinner plans. "Mom, we can't make it this week." His voice sounded strained, distant. "Sarah thinks it's better if we have some space right now." "Space?" "David, what do you mean, space? Did I do something wrong?" I'd sunk into my favorite armchair, the one where I'd rocked him to sleep as a baby, my hands trembling as I gripped the phone. "It's complicated, Mom. Sarah has some concerns about your attitudes towards certain things. She thinks it might not be the best environment for the kids right now." My husband, Robert Cox, my steady companion of 35 years, had been reading his newspaper in his leather recliner when he noticed my distress. At 61, Robert still carried himself with the quiet confidence that had attracted me to him decades ago, though his temples were now silver and laugh lines creased the corners of his kind brown eyes. He set down his paper immediately, his weathered hands reaching for mine as tears began to blur my vision. "What did David say?" Robert's voice carried that gentle tone he used whenever he sensed I needed his strength. His calloused fingers, worn from years of working as a contractor before his retirement, squeezed mine reassuringly. He said Sarah has concerns about my attitudes. "Robert, what attitudes? I've never been anything but loving to that girl. I welcomed her into our family. I helped plan their wedding. I was in the delivery room when both babies were born." The words tumbled out between sobs as the magnitude of the situation began to sink in. That's when my dear friend, Linda Patterson, became my lifeline. Linda, a retired school principal with sharp gray eyes and an even sharper intuition, had been my neighbor for over 15 years. She'd watched David grow up, celebrated his graduation and wedding with us, and had been like a grandmother to Emma and Jake herself. When she knocked on my door that evening, carrying a casserole and wearing the concerned expression I knew meant business, I knew she'd sensed something was terribly wrong. "Margaret, I saw David's car drive past without stopping today. On a Sunday." Linda settled her petite frame into my kitchen chair, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the October wind. "In 15 years, I've never seen that boy miss a Sunday dinner. What's going on?" As I poured coffee into our familiar mugs, the ones Emma had helped me pick out at the pottery store last Christmas, I explained the conversation with David. Linda listened with the patience of someone who'd spent decades dealing with complicated family dynamics, her weathered hands wrapped around the warm ceramic. "This doesn't sound like the David I know," Linda said slowly, her voice thoughtful. "That boy adores you, Margaret. Something else is happening here." Over the following weeks, I tried everything I could think of to reach out. I sent carefully worded text messages to Sarah, expressing my love and confusion about the situation. I dropped off homemade meals on their doorstep, hoping to catch a glimpse of the children. I even drove by their house, my heart breaking when I saw Emma's bicycle in the driveway and Jake's sandbox in the backyard, knowing they were so close yet completely out of reach. Robert suggested we give them time, that whatever misunderstanding had occurred would resolve itself naturally. But as days turned into weeks, his optimism began to waver too. I'd catch him staring out our bedroom window toward the direction of David's house. His shoulders sagged with the weight of missing his grandchildren. It was Linda who finally uncovered the truth. With her network of connections throughout our tight-knit community and her natural ability to piece together fragments of conversation, she began hearing whispers that chilled me to the bone. "Margaret, sit down," Linda said one gray November morning, her usual warm smile replaced by a grim expression. "I've been hearing things around town, and I think I know what's really happening here." And that's when the pattern snapped into place. I sat heavily in my living room armchair, the one Robert had helped me reupholster last spring in a cheerful floral pattern that now seemed to mock the darkness settling over our home. The November light filtered weakly through the sheer curtains, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that Emma and Jake had loved to slide across in their sock feet during our Sunday visits. Linda perched on the edge of the sofa, her usually steady hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her navy slacks. In all the years I'd known her, through neighborhood crises and personal heartaches, I'd never seen her look quite so troubled. "I've been piecing things together from conversations I've overheard," Linda began, her voice lower than usual. "Margaret, I don't think David came up with this racist accusation on his own. The timing, the sudden complete cutoff, the way he seemed almost rehearsed when he confronted you, it all points to someone else orchestrating this." My stomach clenched as I processed her words. "What do you mean, orchestrating?" Linda leaned forward, her gray eyes intense with conviction. "I think Sarah is behind this entire situation. She's been telling David stories, convincing him that you've said or done things that never actually happened." The room seemed to tilt slightly around me. Sarah, my sweet daughter-in-law, who had once brought me flowers every Mother's Day, who had asked for my chocolate chip cookie recipe, and actually listened when I shared stories about David's childhood. The same Sarah who had tearfully thanked me for welcoming her into our family at their wedding reception. "But why?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the quiet room. What could I have possibly done to make her want to keep the children away from me? Linda's expression softened with sympathy, but her voice remained firm. "I don't think it's about anything you did, Margaret. I think it's about control. Some people need to feel like they're the center of their spouse's world, and your close relationship with David might threaten that. I thought back to the past few months, searching for signs I might have missed. There had been moments when Sarah seemed distant during family gatherings, times when she'd grown quiet when David and I discussed family memories or shared inside jokes. I'd attributed it to fatigue from managing 2 young children, never imagining it might be resentment building beneath the surface. The front door opened, and Robert's footsteps echoed in the entryway. He appeared in the living room doorway, still wearing his work coat, his face drawn with exhaustion. At 68, he'd planned to retire this year, but the stress of losing contact with Emma and Jake seemed to have aged him beyond his years. "Any word today?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Linda thinks she knows what's really happening," I said, gesturing for him to join us. "Sit down, Robert. We need to talk about this together." Robert settled into his recliner with a heavy sigh, loosening his tie as Linda repeated her theory. I watched his face change as he processed the information, moving from confusion to hurt, to a quiet anger I rarely saw from my gentle husband. "You're saying Sarah has been lying to our son about his own mother?" Robert's voice was steady, but I could hear the steel underneath. "Convincing him that Margaret is something she's never been?" Linda nodded solemnly. "I believe that's exactly what's happening. And David, trusting his wife completely, believes every word she tells him. He probably thinks he's protecting his children from genuine harm." The cruel irony of it hit me like a physical blow. My son, whom I'd raised to be loyal and protective, was using those very qualities against me based on fabricated stories. The values Robert and I had instilled in him, trust in family, fierce protection of his children, had been weaponized to destroy our relationship. "How do we prove it?" Robert asked, his practical mind already working on solutions. "How do we show David that his mother never said the things he believes she said?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Linda and I exchanged glances, both of us understanding the terrible complexity of the situation. How do you prove a negative? How do you convince someone that conversations they believe happened never actually took place? "We need to get David alone," Linda said thoughtfully. "Away from Sarah's influence, somewhere he can think clearly about what he actually remembers versus what he's been told he should remember." I felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. "Do you really think that could work? What if he refuses to see me?" "He won't refuse to see his father," Robert said quietly, his eyes meeting mine with renewed determination. "Not yet, anyway. Sarah hasn't gotten that far in turning him against us." As we sat in the growing twilight of my living room, the 3 of us began to plan how to save my relationship with my son and grandchildren. But even as hope began to kindle in my chest, a darker thought crept in. If Sarah had been willing to fabricate racist accusations to achieve her goals, what else might she be capable of when she discovered we were fighting back? The telephone rang, cutting through our conversation like a knife. We all froze, staring at the device as if it might explode. After weeks of silence from David and Sarah, any unexpected call felt loaded with possibility and danger. Robert reached for the receiver, his hand hesitating just inches from the phone. Should I answer it? But before any of us could decide, the ringing stopped, leaving us in a silence that felt heavier than before. What we discovered in the days that followed would test everything we thought we knew about family, truth, and the lengths people will go to protect what they believe is theirs. The next morning, Robert left early for work, kissing my forehead and whispering words of encouragement that felt like armor against the day ahead. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my untouched coffee, when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw David standing on my front porch, shifting his weight from foot to foot in that nervous way he'd had since childhood. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the door. "David," I tried to keep my voice steady, neutral. "This is unexpected." He looked terrible. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat hair was disheveled. "Mom, we need to talk." I stepped aside to let him in, my mind racing. Was this the opportunity Robert and Linda had hoped for? Or was David here to deliver another devastating blow? He settled into the same chair where Linda had sat the night before, running his hands through his hair. "Sarah doesn't know I'm here." The admission hung between us like a bridge I was afraid to cross. "Would you like some coffee? You look like you haven't been sleeping." "I haven't been." David accepted the mug I offered, wrapping his hands around it as if seeking warmth. "Mom, I keep trying to remember the exact conversations we supposedly had. The things Sarah says you said about her family." My breath caught. "What do you mean, supposedly?" David looked up at me, and for a moment I saw my little boy again, confused and seeking answers. "I remember being upset after some of our talks, but when I try to recall your exact words, everything gets fuzzy. Sarah always has to remind me what you said, and each time she tells me, the details seem to get worse." I sat down across from him, fighting the urge to reach out and touch his hand. "David, what do you actually remember me saying? Not what Sarah told you I said, but what you personally heard come out of my mouth." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. "That's just it, Mom. I can't pinpoint anything specific." "Sarah says that's normal, that people block out traumatic conversations, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "But what, sweetheart?" "But you raised me, Mom. Even when we disagreed about things, you never spoke with hatred about anyone. You and Dad taught me to judge people by their character, not their background. It doesn't make sense that you would suddenly start spouting the kind of vile things Sarah claims you said." Hope bloomed in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm. "What kind of things is she saying I said?" David's face flushed with embarrassment. "Really ugly stuff, Mom. Comments about her family's culture, their religion, even their appearance. She says you used slurs that I've never heard you use in my entire life." "Because I would never use those words, David. They're not in my vocabulary, because they're not in my heart." He looked up at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the war playing out in his expression. "She showed me text messages she said you sent her directly?" My blood went cold. "Text messages?" "David, I've never texted Sarah anything inappropriate. I barely text at all, you know that." "I know, but she had screenshots on her phone. Mean things about her family, telling her she wasn't good enough for you." David's voice grew smaller. "But Mom, looking at them now, something seemed off about the formatting. And some of the words, they didn't sound like you. David, I need you to think very carefully. Have you ever seen me type these messages? Have you ever witnessed me saying these things to Sarah in person?" The question seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He sat back in his chair, his face going pale. No, I haven't. It's always been Sarah telling me about conversations that happened when I wasn't there, or showing me screenshots, or reminding me about things I supposedly forgot." We sat in silence as the implications settled over us both. I could see David's worldview reshaping itself in real time, and my heart ached for him. Learning that someone you love and trust has been manipulating you is a special kind of betrayal. "Why would she do this?" he whispered, and his voice cracked like a teenager's. Why would Sarah make up lies about you? I think, I said carefully, that Sarah sees me as competition for your loyalty, and maybe for the children's love too. David's hands started shaking around his coffee mug. God, Mom, what have I done? I kept Emma and Jake away from you based on lies. I let Sarah convince me that my own mother was some kind of monster. You were trying to protect your children. That's what good fathers do. But I should have known better. I should have questioned it, should have asked for proof, should have trusted my own memories and instincts. Tears started rolling down his cheeks. How do I fix this? How do I go home and confront Sarah about this without destroying my marriage? The question hit at the heart of everything. Even now, even knowing the truth, David was trapped. Confronting Sarah meant admitting he'd been fooled, meant potentially fracturing his family in a different way. Maybe the question isn't how to confront her, I said slowly, but how to create an environment where the truth can come out naturally. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. What do you mean? What if you told Sarah you wanted to work on repairing our relationship? That you wanted to facilitate a conversation between us where we could address these issues directly? You mean get you two in the same room together? Exactly. If Sarah has been fabricating these conversations and incidents, she'll have a hard time maintaining her story when I'm sitting right there asking for specific details. David considered this, hope creeping into his expression. She couldn't claim you said something to her privately if you were right there saying you never said it. And more importantly, you'd be there to witness the entire conversation. No more second-hand reports or convenient memory lapses. For the first time in our conversation, David almost smiled. She's always said she wanted to clear the air with you, wanted to move past our differences. If I present it as her idea, as a way to heal the family, she can't really refuse. But as we sat there planning this confrontation, neither of us anticipated just how far Sarah would be willing to go to protect her carefully constructed narrative. What happened when we finally got all three of us in the same room would test the very foundation of David's marriage and force all of us to confront truths that were far more disturbing than either of us had imagined. The plan seemed solid when David and I discussed it over coffee, but putting it into action proved more complicated. 3 days later, David called me with an update that made my stomach clench. I brought up the idea of a 3-way conversation to Sarah, he said, his voice tight with frustration. At first she seemed enthusiastic, said she'd been hoping for a chance to clear the air, but then she started adding conditions. What kind of conditions? She wants the conversation to happen at our house, on her turf. She wants to prepare talking points ahead of time, and she suggested we should have a mediator present. I felt a familiar ache in my chest. A mediator? Her sister, apparently. Someone neutral who could help keep things productive. The manipulation was so transparent, it almost took my breath away. Sarah was already setting up the conversation to control the narrative, to have an ally present, to make sure she maintained the upper hand. David, do you see what's happening here? There was a long pause. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, I think I do. The woman who claims she wants to clear the air is already planning how to manage the conversation before it even happens. What did you tell her? I said we needed to keep it simple. Just the three of us, somewhere neutral. Maybe that coffee shop downtown where you and I met. And how did she respond to that? David's laugh was bitter. She said she didn't think that was fair to her, that she deserved to feel comfortable and supported during what would obviously be a difficult conversation for everyone. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of Sarah's twisted logic. Even when caught in lies, she managed to position herself as the victim who needed special accommodations. "So, what's our next move?" I asked. "I've been thinking about that. What if we don't give her time to prepare? What if I just brought Emma and Jake over for a visit and then happened to invite you to join us?" The suggestion made my heart race with both hope and anxiety. "David, that could backfire spectacularly. If Sarah feels ambushed, she might escalate things in front of the children." "Or," David said, and I could hear the determination growing in his voice, "she might finally be forced to have an honest conversation without a script." That Saturday, David texted me, "Bringing the kids to the park on Elm Street in an hour. Sarah's staying home with a headache. Want to see your grandchildren?" I drove to the park with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. It had been 4 months since I'd seen Emma and Jake, and the anticipation felt overwhelming. They were bigger than I remembered. Emma, now 8, was pushing 6-year-old Jake on the swing set when I approached. For a moment, they both looked uncertain, as if trying to remember who I was. "Grandma?" Emma said tentatively. "Hi, sweetheart," I managed, my voice catching. "I've missed you both so much." Jake jumped off the swing and ran to me, wrapping his small arms around my waist. "Daddy said you were sick and couldn't see us." I looked over his head at David, who had the grace to look ashamed. "I'm feeling much better now," I told Jake. For the next hour, we played together like no time had passed. Emma showed me how she could pump the swing by herself now. Jake insisted I push him down the slide 17 times. David watched us with a mixture of joy and guilt that was painful to witness. It was Jake who innocently provided the opening we needed. "Grandma, Mommy said you don't like us because we're too loud," he said as I was tying his shoe. "But you seem to like us." My hands stilled on his shoelaces. "Jake, I love you and Emma more than anything in the world. I love spending time with you, even when you're being loud and silly." Emma joined us on the bench. "Mommy said you called her bad names." I looked at David, who was staring at his children with dawning horror. This was it, the moment of truth. But it was coming from the mouths of babes who didn't understand the game they'd been caught up in. "Emma, I have never called your mother bad names." "I've barely spoken to your mother at all in the past year." "But she said you did," Emma insisted, her 8-year-old logic trying to make sense of conflicting information. David knelt down beside his daughter. "Emma, what else did Mommy say about Grandma?" "That she was mean to people who look different. That she said bad things about Jake's friend Marcus." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Marcus was Jake's best friend from school, a sweet little boy whose parents had emigrated from Ghana. I'd met him exactly once, at Jake's birthday party last year, and had spent 10 minutes talking with him about his impressive dinosaur knowledge. "Jake," I said gently, "do you remember when Marcus came to your birthday party? Do you remember me being mean to him?" Jake scrunched up his face, thinking hard. "No. You talked to him about T-Rex. He liked you." David's face had gone pale. "Kids, can you play on the monkey bars for a few minutes? I need to talk to Grandma." As Emma and Jake ran off, David sank onto the bench beside me. "She's been poisoning them against you, using specific examples that sound believable to children, but that I know aren't true. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before David could answer, his phone buzzed with a text. He looked at it, and his expression darkened further. "It's Sarah. She's wondering where we are and why we've been gone so long." He looked up at me. "She's going to know something's up when we get home." "The kids are going to mention seeing you." "Good. I said firmly. Let them mention it. Let's see what story she comes up with when she's caught off guard. But as we gathered up the children and prepared to leave the park, none of us could have predicted just how far Sarah would go when she realized her carefully constructed web of lies was finally unraveling. The drive to David's house was tense. Jake and Emma chattered excitedly about their unexpected visit to the park, while David gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. I sat in the passenger seat, my stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Daddy, can we tell Mommy about the swings?" Emma asked from the back seat. "You can tell Mommy whatever you want, sweetheart," David replied, his voice carefully neutral. "And about how Grandma helped Jake when he scraped his knee?" "That too." I glanced at David. His jaw was set in that determined way I remembered from when he was a teenager facing down school bullies. He'd made his choice, and there was no backing down now. As we pulled into the driveway, Sarah appeared at the front door before David had even turned off the engine. Her expression was curious but guarded, and I could see her eyes narrow slightly when she spotted me in the passenger seat. "Well, this is unexpected," Sarah said as we all climbed out of the car. Her voice was carefully modulated, the tone she used when she was trying to sound pleasant but wasn't feeling it. "Mommy, we saw Grandma at the park," Emma announced, running up to give Sarah a hug. "She pushed me on the swings really high." Sarah's smile looked painted on. "Did she now? How interesting." Jake bounded over. "And she helped me when I fell down. She had Band-Aids in her purse, just like you do." "I'm sure she did," Sarah said, her eyes meeting mine over Jake's head. There was something calculating in her gaze, like she was rapidly trying to figure out how to spin this unexpected development. David carried Emma's jacket toward the house. "The kids were having such a good time. I figured we could all come back together. Maybe have some coffee and actually talk for once." Sarah's laugh sounded forced. "Of course. How lovely. Come in, everyone." As we settled in the living room, I could feel the undercurrents of tension swirling around us. Jake and Emma seemed oblivious, busy showing me drawings they'd made at school, but Sarah was watching every interaction with hawk-like intensity. "So?" Sarah said, settling into her chair with exaggerated casualness. "I have to admit, I'm surprised to see you here. David mentioned you've been very busy lately." I met her gaze steadily. "Not too busy for my grandchildren? I'm never too busy for them." "Of course not," Sarah agreed smoothly. "Though I know you have such strong opinions about so many things. It must be exhausting, keeping track of all your concerns." David looked up sharply from where he was helping Jake with a puzzle. "What kind of concerns?" Sarah waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, you know how your mother gets. Always something to worry about, always someone to criticize." "Mommy," Emma piped up innocently, "Grandma didn't criticize anybody at the park. She was nice to the lady with the baby stroller when we almost ran into her." Sarah's smile flickered for just a moment. "Well, that's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm glad Grandma was on her best behavior." "Her best behavior?" I repeated slowly. "Sarah, what exactly do you mean by that?" "Nothing specific," Sarah said quickly. "Just that we all try to be our best selves around the children, don't we?" David set down the puzzle piece he was holding. "Sarah, what have you been telling the kids about Mom?" "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." David's voice was getting firmer. "They said some things at the park today. Things about Mom not liking them because they're loud, about her calling you names." Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly. "Children misunderstand things sometimes. They mix up stories." "Do they?" I asked quietly. "Because Emma mentioned that I supposedly said bad things about Marcus. You remember Marcus, don't you? Jake's friend who came to the birthday party?" "I don't recall exactly what was said about Marcus," Sarah replied, but her voice was less steady now. Jake looked up from his puzzle. Marcus is my best friend. Grandma likes Marcus. She knew all about dinosaurs just like him. That's right, I said, keeping my tone gentle but my eyes on Sarah. Marcus and I had a wonderful conversation about paleontology. He's a brilliant little boy. I was hoping he'd come around for more playdates. Sarah's composure was starting to crack around the edges. Well, scheduling has been difficult lately. Because you told Marcus's parents I was racist, David said flatly. It wasn't a question. The room went completely silent except for the sound of Emma's crayon moving across her paper. Sarah's face had gone pale, then flushed again. That's not... I never said exactly that. What did you say exactly? David pressed. Sarah glanced around the room as if looking for an escape route. I may have mentioned that your mother has some old-fashioned views about certain things. Old-fashioned views? I repeated. About what, specifically? You know what I'm talking about, Sarah said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. Some of the comments you've made? What comments? David demanded. Give me one specific example. Sarah's mouth opened and closed like she was grasping for words. There have been so many little things over the years. Name one, I said quietly. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. Emma continued coloring, humming softly to herself, while Jake worked on his puzzle with intense concentration. They seemed to sense the adult tension, but weren't quite sure what to make of it. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice smaller than before. I just felt like there was always judgment, always criticism. From me? I asked. Or from David? Sarah's eyes darted to her husband. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, David said slowly. I think this was never really about Mom at all. The weight of David's words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Sarah's face cycled through emotions, defiance, fear, something that might have been relief. The afternoon light streaming through the living room windows seemed harsher now, illuminating the dust motes that danced between us like tiny witnesses to this unraveling. David, please, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above Jake's soft humming as he fitted puzzle pieces together. But David wasn't backing down. I could see something shifting in his posture, in the set of his jaw. Years of doubt and confusion were crystallizing into understanding, and it was both beautiful and heartbreaking to watch. No, he said, his voice gaining strength. I need to understand this. You've been telling me for months that Mom was making racist comments, that she was making you uncomfortable. But you can't give me a single specific example. Sarah's hands were trembling slightly as she smoothed down Emma's hair. Emma looked up at her mother with those wide, innocent eyes. Mommy, are you sad? Emma asked. No, sweetheart, just tired. Sarah's voice cracked on the last word. I leaned forward in my chair, choosing my words carefully. Sarah, when you said there was always judgment and criticism, were you talking about me judging you? Or were you talking about David? Sarah's breathing became shallow. She glanced toward the kitchen, toward the front door, anywhere but at David or me. I don't understand why we're doing this, she said. Because our children have been kept away from their grandmother, David said, his voice steady but firm. Because Marcus's parents think my mother is racist. Because I've been questioning everything I thought I knew about the woman who raised me. Jake suddenly looked up from his puzzle. Daddy, why can't we see Grandma more? The question was so innocent, so direct, that it cut through all our adult complications like a knife through butter. David's face softened as he looked at his son. That's what we're trying to figure out, buddy. I like visiting Grandma, Jake said matter-of-factly. She has good snacks and she knows about dinosaurs. She taught me about the T-Rex's tiny arms. Sarah's composure finally began to completely crumble. Tears gathered in her eyes, but there was something desperate in her expression now. You don't understand the pressure I've been under, she said, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and glanced at the children. The constant questions about everything. How I cook, how I dress the kids, how I keep the house. David stared at her. From Mom? From you! The words burst out of Sarah before she could stop them. It's always, Mom did it this way, or Mom thinks that, or Mom says. I felt like I was competing with a ghost, like nothing I did was ever good enough because it wasn't how your precious mother would do it. The room fell silent, except for Emma's crayons scratching against paper. She was drawing what looked like a house with stick figures in front of it. David's face went through a series of changes. Confusion, recognition, then something that looked like devastation. So you made her the villain, he said quietly. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just needed some space. Some time to feel like I could be a good wife and mother without constantly being measured against someone else's standard. I felt my heart breaking, not just for the months of separation from my grandchildren, but for this young woman who had felt so threatened, so inadequate, that she'd constructed an elaborate lie to protect herself. Sarah, I said gently, I never meant to make you feel that way. But you did, she said, looking at me directly for the first time. Maybe not intentionally, but every time David would mention something you'd said or done, it felt like criticism of me. David ran his hands through his hair. God, Sarah, why didn't you just talk to me about this? Why didn't you tell me how you were feeling instead of making me think my mother was racist? Sarah's tears were flowing freely now. Because then you'd know how jealous and petty I really am? How insecure? It was easier to make it her fault than to admit that I felt like I was failing at everything. Emma suddenly stood up and walked over to her mother, pressing her small drawing into Sarah's hands. I drew our family, Emma announced. See? There's you and Daddy and me and Jake. And there's Grandma too, because she's family. Sarah looked down at the drawing, and a sob escaped her throat. In Emma's innocent artwork, we were all standing together in front of a house, stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Grandma's in the middle, Emma explained, pointing with a purple crayon. Because she gives the best hugs. The simple truth of a child's perspective hung in the air between us. David reached over and took the drawing, studying it with wonder and pain in his eyes. She does give the best hugs, he said softly. Sarah buried her face in her hands. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it. I just felt like I was drowning, like I could never measure up. I stood up from my chair and moved toward her, slowly, giving her time to object if she needed to. When she didn't pull away, I knelt beside her chair and gently placed my hand on her shoulder. You never had to measure up to anything, I said. You're Emma and Jake's mother. That's not a role anyone else can fill. Sarah looked up at me through her tears. But David always talks about how perfect you were. How you always knew what to do. I couldn't help but laugh, though it came out shaky. Oh, honey, I made so many mistakes raising David. So many nights I lay awake wondering if I was ruining everything. There's no perfect way to be a mother. David was staring at both of us with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I had no idea," he said. "Sarah, I had no idea you felt that way. And Mom, I never realized that my talking about you made Sarah feel criticized." "We all made mistakes," I said. "But we can fix this." Sarah shook her head. "I don't know how. I told people you were racist. I kept the children away from you for months. I made David doubt his own mother." "The truth," David said firmly. "We start with the truth." Sarah's face went pale again. "David, I can't. People will think I'm horrible. They'll think I'm crazy." "What people?" I asked. Sarah hesitated, then looked at David with an expression that might have been fear. "Who else did you tell, Sarah?" David asked, his voice taking on a warning tone. Sarah's silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. David leaned forward in his chair, and I could see his jaw tightening with each passing second. "Sarah," he said again, his voice more insistent now. "Who else knows about this?" Emma looked up from her coloring, sensing the tension in the room even if she didn't understand it. "Mommy, why are you crying again?" Sarah quickly wiped her eyes and forced a smile for Emma. "Mommy's okay, sweetheart. Just talking about grown-up things." But David wasn't letting it go. "We can't fix this if I don't know how far it's spread." Sarah glanced at me, then back at David, and I saw her shoulders sag in defeat. "Your sister," she whispered. "I told Catherine." David's face went completely white. "You told my sister that our mother is racist?" "It was when she called last month asking why we hadn't been to family dinner in so long. I panicked. She kept asking questions and I just—" Sarah's voice trailed off. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. Catherine was my daughter, my only other child, and she lived 3 states away. We talked every Sunday, and she hadn't said a word about this to me. "What exactly did you tell her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah looked down at her hands. "I said that you had made some comments about my background that made me uncomfortable, that you didn't think I was good enough for David because of my heritage." "Mom's heritage is Puerto Rican?" David said to me, as if I needed the clarification. "Sarah, you told Catherine that my mother was being racist about Puerto Rican culture?" "I didn't use the word racist directly with her," Sarah said quickly. "I just said you were prejudiced and that it was creating problems." Jake, who had been quietly building with his blocks, suddenly knocked his tower over with more force than necessary. "I don't like when people are mad," he announced. Emma nodded seriously. "Me neither. Can we have snacks?" "In a minute, babies," I said, using the pet name I'd always called them. Then I turned back to Sarah. "What did Catherine say when you told her this?" Sarah's face crumpled again. "She said she was shocked, that you'd never shown any signs of being prejudiced before, but that she talked to you about it. She said family comes first, and that you needed to apologize and change your behavior." David stood up abruptly and started pacing. "So for the past month, Catherine has been thinking our mother is a racist, and Mom, you've had no idea why Catherine's been acting strange on your phone calls." The pieces suddenly clicked into place for me. "She has been different," I said slowly. "Shorter conversations. Less personal. I thought she was just busy with work." "She's probably been trying to figure out how to confront you about it," David said, running his hands through his hair. "God, Sarah, Catherine adores Mom. This must be tearing her apart." Sarah was crying again. I know I messed everything up. When Catherine said she'd talk to you, I panicked even more. I begged David to not visit you until I could figure out what to do." "So you doubled down on the lie," I said, not accusingly, but trying to understand. I told myself I'd fix it somehow, that I'd find a way to tell Catherine it was a misunderstanding. But then weeks went by, and it just got worse and worse. Emma tugged on my sleeve. "Grandma, is Mommy in trouble?" I looked down at her innocent face and felt my heart break a little more. "No, sweetheart. Mommy just made a mistake, and we're trying to figure out how to fix it." "Like when I broke your vase and didn't tell you right away?" Emma asked. "Exactly like that," I said. David stopped pacing and looked at his daughter with surprise. "You broke Mom's vase?" Emma nodded solemnly. "The pretty blue one. I was trying to smell the flowers and I knocked it over. But then I told Grandma the truth, and she said truth is always better than hiding." Sarah let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "A 4-year-old has better judgment than I do." "We all make mistakes when we're scared," I said gently. "But Emma's right. The truth is always better." David sat back down and took Sarah's hands in his. "We have to call Catherine, tonight." "David, I can't. What if she hates me? What if she never forgives me? What if we don't tell her, and she spends the rest of her life thinking Mom is a racist?" David shot back. "What happens at Christmas when we're all supposed to be together?" "Catherine will be watching Mom's every interaction with you and the kids, looking for signs of prejudice that don't exist." I hadn't even thought about Christmas, still 2 months away. Catherine always came home for Christmas. The idea of her spending the holiday scrutinizing my every word, thinking I harbored racist feelings about my own daughter-in-law and grandchildren, made me feel sick. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly. David and I both stared at her. "What else?" David asked, his voice tight. Sarah looked at Jake, who was now lining up his toy cars in careful rows, then at Emma, who was adding flowers to her family drawing. Catherine asked if she should tell other people in the family. She was worried about the kids being around you unsupervised. The room went completely silent, except for the sound of Jake making car noises. "What other people?" I whispered. "Your sister Margaret and your brother James." David's face had gone from white to red. "Sarah, please tell me you didn't let Catherine spread this to Aunt Margaret and Uncle James." I told her not to say anything yet, that I wanted to handle it privately first. But David, she was so upset. She said she needed to think about whether the children should be around your mother at all. My hands started shaking. Margaret was my younger sister, and James was my older brother. We were a close family. Margaret lived just one town over and watched Emma and Jake sometimes when David and Sarah had date nights. James and his wife hosted every major holiday. So, Catherine thinks I'm racist, and she's considering telling Margaret and James, who have no idea any of this is happening. I said, trying to process it all. "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered. "I never meant for it to go this far." Emma suddenly stood up and walked over to Sarah. "Mommy, you should say sorry to Grandma like I said sorry to Grandma about the vase." Sarah looked down at Emma, tears streaming down her face. "I am saying sorry, baby." "But you should hug her too," Emma insisted. "Hugs make sorry better." Sarah looked at me uncertainly. I opened my arms, and after a moment's hesitation, she leaned into them. As I held my daughter-in-law, feeling her shake with sobs, I realized how young she still was. How overwhelmed she must have felt trying to navigate being a new mother while feeling like she was competing with me. "We're going to fix this," I murmured into her hair. "All of it." When we separated, David was watching us with an expression I couldn't read. "Catherine's going to call Mom on Sunday like she always does," he said. "That's in 3 days. We need to figure out what we're going to do before then." "I could call her first," I suggested. And say what? That you want to discuss the racist comments you didn't make? David shook his head. She'll know something's up. Sarah wiped her eyes. I should be the one to call her. I should tell her I lied. She's going to want to know why, David pointed out. Are you ready to explain that you were jealous of my mother? Before Sarah could answer, Jake appeared at my elbow holding one of his toy cars. Grandma, will you play cars with me? I looked around the room at the mess we'd created with our adult problems, then at my grandson's hopeful face. Of course, sweetheart. As I got down on the floor with Jake, I heard Sarah say quietly to David, What if Catherine never forgives me? What if none of them do? Then we deal with that when it happens, David replied. But first, we tell the truth. Jake handed me a red car and pointed to an elaborate roadway he'd constructed out of blocks. You can be the fire truck, Grandma. I'm the police car. We have to save people. What kind of emergency are we responding to? I asked, grateful for the simplicity of a child's game. Jake thought for a moment, his little face serious. People are lost and scared, and we have to help them find their way home. I glanced up at David and Sarah, who were looking down at us with expressions of surprise and something that might have been hope. Then we better get started, I said to Jake. Saving people is important work. But even as I played with my grandson, my mind was racing. In 3 days, Catherine would call, expecting our normal Sunday chat, having no idea that her world was about to be turned upside down. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a terrible thought was forming. What if Catherine had already decided she couldn't wait? What if she was already reaching out to Margaret and James? What if it was already too late? That evening, after Jake had gone to bed, the 3 of us sat around David's kitchen table with cups of coffee that had long gone cold. The weight of Sunday's approaching phone call hung over us like a storm cloud. I keep thinking about what I'm going to say, Sarah said, tracing the rim of her mug with her finger. How do you tell someone you've been lying about their mother being racist? How do you even start that conversation? David reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Maybe we should practice it. Run through what you're going to say. Practice lying about lying? Sarah's laugh was bitter. God, when you put it like that, it sounds even worse. I had been quiet for most of the evening, turning over possibilities in my mind. What if we don't wait until Sunday? I said finally. What if we call her tomorrow? Catherine's going to know something's wrong the minute I call on a Thursday instead of Sunday, Sarah protested. She's going to be suspicious before I even say anything. She's going to be suspicious anyway, David pointed out. At least this way, we control when it happens. Sarah stood up abruptly and walked to the kitchen window, staring out into the darkness. You don't understand. Catherine and I, we talk about everything. She tells me about her job, her boyfriend troubles, what she's planning to do on weekends. And this whole time, I've been poisoning those conversations with lies about Margaret. The pain in her voice was evident, and I felt my heart clench. Sarah, Catherine loves you. That's not going to change. Isn't it? She turned back to face us, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Margaret, I told her you made comments about her eating habits being typical for her culture. I told her you asked if she was really planning to teach Jake foreign recipes. I made you sound like a monster. David's face had gone pale. Jesus, Sarah. No wonder she was so upset. The worst part is how easily the lies came. Sarah continued, her voice breaking. Catherine would call and mention something about her heritage or her family's traditions, and I would just twist it, make it sound like you had opinions about it. And Catherine would get so hurt and angry, and I would comfort her and tell her I was dealing with you, that she didn't need to worry about it. I felt physically sick hearing the details, but I forced myself to ask, "What else, Sarah? I need to know everything if we're going to fix this." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. "I told her you said Jake was getting too attached to Korean foods and stories. I said you were worried he wouldn't fit in properly if he was too connected to Catherine's culture. I made it sound like you wanted to erase that part of him." "Oh, Sarah." The words came out as barely a whisper. I thought about all the times Catherine had seemed withdrawn during our brief interactions, how she'd barely looked at me during family gatherings. She must think I hate everything about who she is. David ran his hands through his hair. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea it was this bad." "It gets worse," Sarah said quietly. "Last month, when Catherine mentioned wanting to take Jake to the Korean Cultural Festival downtown, I told her you'd said it would be confusing for him, that you thought he needed to focus on being American first." I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. Catherine must have been devastated. She was. She cried for an hour on the phone, and I sat there comforting her, telling her I understood how hard it must be to have a grandmother who didn't accept her grandchild's full heritage. Sarah's voice was raw now. "I am such a horrible person." "You're not horrible," David said firmly. "You made mistakes, bad ones, but we're going to fix them." "How?" Sarah demanded. "How do I tell Catherine that every conversation we've had about this for the past 2 years has been built on lies? How do I explain that I was jealous of a woman who has never been anything but kind to me?" I stood up and walked over to Sarah, taking her hands in mine. "You tell her the truth, all of it. You tell her you were struggling as a new mother and you felt inadequate. You tell her you were afraid Jake would love me more than you, and that fear made you do terrible things. She's going to hate me." "Maybe," I said honestly. "She's going to be angry, certainly. She's going to be hurt. But Catherine is a good person, Sarah. She's going to understand that people can make mistakes and still be worthy of forgiveness." David joined us by the window. "The three of us are going to call her together. We're going to tell her everything, and then we're going to figure out how to move forward." Sarah looked between us. "What if she doesn't believe us? What if she thinks this is some elaborate cover-up?" "Then we keep trying," I said. "We keep telling the truth until she believes it, however long that takes." We stood there in the quiet kitchen, the three of us bound together by the mess we'd created and our determination to clean it up. But even as I felt a glimmer of hope about reaching Catherine, a new worry began to gnaw at me. "Sarah," I said slowly, "these conversations with Catherine about the things I supposedly said, were they just between you two, or did she ever mention talking to other people about it?" Sarah's face went white. "Oh, God. Margaret, I think she might have called her mother last week." My heart sank. Catherine's mother lived in Seoul. If Catherine had called her about this, it meant the story had traveled halfway around the world. It meant Catherine's entire family might believe I was a racist grandmother who rejected their culture and their daughter. "What exactly did she tell you about that conversation?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah sat back down heavily at the kitchen table. "She said she was so upset after our talk about the cultural festival that she needed to call her mom for support. She told me her mother was furious and said something about how American grandmothers always think they know better than Korean mothers." David closed his eyes. "Mom, do you understand what this means? Catherine's family in Korea thinks you're prejudiced against them? When we visit Seoul next summer, I'm going to be walking into a room full of people who believe my mother is a racist. The weight of it hit me all at once. This wasn't just about Catherine and me anymore. This lie had roots that stretched across oceans, into a family I'd never met, but desperately wanted to love me. Catherine's mother, her siblings, her extended family, they all had an image of me as someone who rejected their heritage and their daughter. "I feel sick," Sarah whispered. "I've ruined everything, not just here, but for Catherine's whole family." I walked to the window and stared out at Jake's swing set in the backyard. David had built it himself last spring, painting it bright blue, because Jake had insisted it match the sky. Such a simple, happy memory, and now I wondered if I'd ever see Jake play on it again. "There's something else," Sarah said so quietly I almost didn't hear her. Catherine mentioned that her mother wanted to video call with Jake last weekend to practice Korean with him. But Catherine said she wasn't comfortable with it while Jake was staying here. She said she didn't want her mother to see him at your house. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Catherine was protecting her son from me even during video calls with his other grandmother. She was that convinced I would somehow poison those precious moments between Jake and his Korean family. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, turning back to face them. "The video call thing started about 6 months ago," Sarah admitted. Catherine's mother has been trying to teach Jake simple Korean phrases and tell him stories about their family history. But Catherine always makes sure these calls happen at our house now. David stood up abruptly and began pacing around the kitchen. 6 months. Mom, Jake's other grandmother has been actively involved in his life for 6 months, and you didn't even know about it because Catherine was so afraid of your reaction. The irony was devastating. I had been desperate for any connection with my grandson, any involvement in his daily life, while Catherine had been carefully orchestrating his relationship with his other grandmother around what she believed were my racist attitudes. Jake had been learning Korean songs and hearing stories about Seoul, and Catherine had been terrified to let me know any of it was happening. She must think I'd forbid it or say something cruel to Jake about his Korean side, I said, the realization settling over me like lead. Sarah nodded miserably. "I told her you'd said it was important for Jake to focus on English first, that you thought too much Korean would confuse him academically." "I would never say that. Never." My voice was stronger than I felt. "Learning multiple languages is a gift. Understanding multiple cultures makes children more empathetic, more intelligent, more connected to the world." "I know that now," Sarah said. "But I was so scared that Jake would prefer his Korean grandmother, that she'd have this special bond with him that I couldn't compete with. When Catherine would light up talking about these video calls, I felt so inadequate." David stopped pacing and looked at both of us. "We need to make that phone call to Catherine tonight. This can't wait any longer. Every day we delay is another day Jake's missing out on having both his grandmothers in his life properly." But even as I agreed, another worry was forming. What if Catherine doesn't believe us? What if she thinks this confession is too convenient, too well-timed? What if she thinks we rehearsed this whole thing? The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock. We were about to attempt something that felt impossible. Convincing someone that 2 years of consistent stories from a trusted source were elaborate lies, and we had to do it knowing that Catherine's mother, thousands of miles away, was also part of this tangled web of misunderstanding. Sarah looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Margaret, what if calling her makes everything worse?" I looked at Sarah, seeing my own fears reflected in her face. The question hung in the air between us like a sword. What if calling Catherine did make everything worse? What if our attempt to fix this shattered what little relationship remained? Sarah? I said carefully. It can't get much worse than it already is. I haven't seen Jake in person in over 2 months. Catherine barely speaks to me when she does visit. And now I know she's been hiding an entire relationship from me because she thinks I'm a racist. David pulled his chair closer to the table. But we have to be smart about how we approach this. Catherine's not going to just take our word for it. Think about it from her perspective. For 2 years, her husband has been telling her specific stories about Mom's racist comments. Now suddenly, we're calling to say it was all lies? The weight of that reality settled over me. 2 years of consistent lies created a foundation that couldn't be demolished with a single conversation. Catherine had built her understanding of me on David's stories, had made parenting decisions based on them, had probably defended those decisions to her own mother. Maybe we should start smaller, Sarah suggested, her voice tentative. Instead of calling tonight and dropping this bombshell, what if Margaret just tried to rebuild the relationship first? Show Catherine through actions that she's not the person David described. I shook my head firmly. No, Sarah, I appreciate the suggestion, but think about what you're saying. You want me to spend months or years trying to prove I'm not racist to my daughter-in-law while my grandson grows up thinking his grandmother doesn't care about his Korean heritage? While Catherine's mother continues to believe I'm some kind of bigot who would hurt her grandson? David was nodding slowly. Mom's right. The longer we wait, the more damage gets done. And Catherine deserves to know the truth. She's been making decisions about her son's life based on lies I told her. Sarah bit her lip. But David, what if she doesn't believe you? What if she thinks you're just saying this now because you finally realize how much damage it's caused? The question hit its target. David's face went pale, and I could see him grappling with exactly that fear. His lies had been so consistent, so detailed, that the truth might sound like just another manipulation. Then I'll have to find a way to prove it, David said quietly. Maybe I can remember specific conversations where I made things up, details that Catherine could verify never actually happened. I thought about this approach, trying to imagine how such a conversation would unfold. Catherine, remember when I told you my mother said Korean food smells weird? Well, I made that up. The absurdity of it struck me. We were planning to convince someone of the truth by cataloging lies. What about her mother? I asked. Catherine's been sharing these stories with her mother for 2 years. Even if Catherine believes us, her mother is going to think we manipulated her daughter. The silence stretched between us again. David drummed his fingers on the table, a nervous habit I remembered from his childhood. Sarah stared into her coffee cup like it might contain answers. Finally, David spoke. I think we're overthinking this. Yes, it's going to be difficult. Yes, Catherine might not believe us at first, but the alternative is letting this continue, and that's not acceptable. He looked directly at me. Mom, Catherine is fundamentally a fair person. She's protective of Jake, yes, but she's not unreasonable. If we approach this honestly, if I take full responsibility for the lies, I think she'll listen. Sarah raised her head. What if we invited her over first? Had this conversation in person instead of over the phone? It might be harder for her to dismiss us if she can see our faces, see how serious we are. I considered this. There was something appealing about the idea of having this conversation in my kitchen, around this same table where David had just confessed everything to me. But there were risks too. If we invite her over without telling her why, she might feel ambushed, I said. But if we tell her we need to talk about something important involving David and his stories about me, she might refuse to come. David stood up and began pacing again. What if I called her first? Asked her to come over because I needed to tell her something important about my relationship with Mom? That's not technically lying. I do need to tell her about my lies, which are definitely about my relationship with you. The approach had merit, but something was still bothering me. David, there's something else we need to consider. When Catherine finds out the truth, she's going to be angry. Not just at you for lying, but at herself for believing the lies. She might feel foolish or guilty about keeping Jake away from me unnecessarily. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Margaret's right. Catherine's going to have to process a lot of emotions all at once. Anger, embarrassment, maybe even grief for the relationship between you and Jake that was lost because of this. David stopped pacing and looked at both of us. So what are you suggesting? That we don't tell her? No, I said firmly. We absolutely have to tell her. But we need to be prepared for her reaction to be complicated. She might lash out, or she might shut down completely. We need to give her space to feel whatever she needs to feel. The conversation was helping me understand just how complex this situation had become. It wasn't just about correcting misinformation. It was about unwinding 2 years of decisions, emotions, and relationships that had been built on a false foundation. There's something else, I said slowly. When Catherine learns the truth, she's going to want to know why David lied in the first place. We need to be ready for that conversation too.